Some men are erased so completely that their suffering becomes invisible, their persecution rewritten as moral judgment. What happens when the most powerful person in a kingdom is systematically destroyed for loving the wrong people? Who decides which lives deserve to disappear? This was not a king who died peacefully in his bed. This was a man whose throne was stolen from him, whose reputation was shredded in public squares, whose life ended with a knife blade, all because he loved young men instead of producing royal heirs. Henry III of France lost everything. His political authority crumbled as enemies weaponized his relationships with beautiful male favorites called mignons. His religious legitimacy collapsed when Catholic factions declared his court morally corrupt. His physical safety vanished when assassins decided his death would cleanse the kingdom. By 1589, the most powerful monarch in Europe had been reduced to a target, hunted through his own palace corridors. The royal archives that survived reveal a deliberate campaign of destruction. Court records show systematic isolation. Diplomatic correspondence tracks foreign powers withdrawing support. Parliamentary documents record nobles abandoning their king. Each preserved letter, each political pamphlet, each contemporary chronicle builds the same devastating picture. A sovereign systematically stripped of power because he refused to hide his forbidden desires. Most of these sealed royal files only surface because enough people stay inside this archive. Please subscribe to the channel, because once these doors close, they do not reopen. Contemporary accounts describe a king who never learned to conceal his affections. Pierre de l'Estoile's diary entries record Henry walking hand in hand with his favorites through the Louvre corridors. Court memoirs detail intimate ceremonies where the king personally dressed his mignons in jewels and silk. Palace account books show extraordinary expenditures on gifts for young men whose only qualification was their beauty. The political consequences accumulated quickly. Parliamentary records from the 1570s show mounting criticism of royal expenses on male favorites. Diplomatic dispatches reveal foreign ambassadors reporting back about the French king's unnatural attachments. Catholic clergy began questioning whether such a monarch could legitimately rule a Christian kingdom. But the most damaging evidence came from the streets. Political pamphlets flooded Paris, describing in explicit detail what happened behind closed palace doors. These broadsheets, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale, contain accusations that destroyed royal authority more effectively than any military defeat. They depicted a weak king controlled by pretty boys, a sovereign who chose personal pleasure over dynastic duty. The mignons themselves became targets. Court chronicles record attacks on royal favorites in palace hallways. Some were beaten by rival nobles. Others fled to provincial estates for protection. The most beautiful ones, those who held the king's deepest affections, found themselves marked for assassination. Henry's political enemies understood something crucial. Destroying the king's lovers would destroy the king himself. They had found the most efficient way to topple a throne. But who were these young men who held such dangerous power over Europe's mightiest sovereign? Their names appear in royal account books like recurring payments to beautiful ghosts. Jacques de Lévis, Duc de Joyeuse, Anne de Joyeuse, Jean-Louis de Nogaret de la Valette, François d'O. These were not courtiers who earned their positions through military service or noble bloodlines. These were young men whose power came from one source, the French king's sexual desire. Court chronicles describe the mignons as an exclusive brotherhood of male beauty that surrounded Henry III like a protective shield. Contemporary memoirs record their ages, most barely 20, some still teenagers when they first caught the king's attention. Palace inventories catalogue the extraordinary gifts Henry showered upon them. Emerald earrings, pearl necklaces, silk gowns embroidered with gold thread. These boys dressed like women, wore makeup, perfumed their hair, and held more political influence than seasoned diplomats. The Venetian ambassador's dispatches, preserved in the state archives of Venice, contain detailed descriptions of court ceremonies where the mignons performed intimate services for their king. They helped Henry dress each morning, arranged his jewelry, styled his hair. But the most shocking detail appears repeatedly in foreign diplomatic reports. These young men shared the king's bed, openly and without pretense. Pierre de l'Estoile's journal entries reveal the systematic process by which beautiful boys became royal favorites. Court officials would identify attractive young nobles from provincial families. These candidates would be brought to Versailles for royal inspection. Those who pleased the king's eye would receive immediate elevation, titles, estates, armed guards for protection. The most favored ones gained access to the king's private chambers, his political councils, his deepest secrets. But political power through sexual favor created deadly jealousies. Court memoirs describe violent rivalries between mignons competing for royal attention. Some favorites hired bodyguards to protect themselves from assassination attempts by rival lovers. Others fled court entirely when their influence began to wane, knowing that loss of the king's affection meant loss of protection. The Catholic nobility watched this transformation of royal court culture with mounting horror. Diplomatic correspondence shows foreign powers questioning whether France could remain a reliable ally under such leadership. Parliamentary records reveal mounting criticism of royal expenses on male favorites, while the kingdom faced military threats from Spain and religious civil war. The mignons understood their precarious position perfectly. Surviving letters between royal favorites reveal their awareness that political enemies were systematically documenting their influence over the king. They knew their relationships with Henry made them targets for assassination, but the rewards, wealth, titles, protection, seemed worth the risk. What they could not foresee was how completely their enemies would weaponize the king's love for them. Political factions began treating the mignons not as individuals, but as evidence of royal corruption that justified rebellion. The surveillance had already begun. Every gift, every private meeting, every intimate gesture was being recorded by those who planned to use this information to destroy both king and favorites. But who was watching? And how did they plan to turn royal love into a weapon of political destruction? The Louvre had become a fortress under siege, but the enemy was already inside the walls. Court records reveal a systematic network of spies, informants, and documentary surveillance that transformed royal intimacy into political intelligence. Every kiss, every private conversation, every shared bed became evidence in a case being built against the French crown. Diplomatic dispatches from the Spanish embassy, preserved in the Simancas archives, detail a coordinated intelligence operation targeting Henry III's relationships with his mignons. Ambassador Bernardino de Mendoza's reports describe hiring palace servants to document royal private moments. Kitchen staff recorded which favorites received meals in the king's chambers. Guards tracked which young men entered royal bedrooms and when they emerged. Seamsters reported on intimate garments ordered for male favorites. The Catholic League had embedded agents throughout the royal household. Contemporary chronicles describe how rival nobles planted spies among the mignons themselves, turning some favorites into informants against their lovers. Court memoirs reveal that even Henry's most trusted servants, valets, secretaries, chaplains, were reporting royal behavior to political enemies. But the most damaging surveillance came from an unexpected source: the royal court itself. Palace account books show that competing nobles were systematically documenting royal expenses on male favorites, creating financial evidence of the king's priorities. Every jeweled earring, every silk gown, every private feast became a line item in a ledger that would later be used as proof of royal corruption. Foreign ambassadors coordinated their intelligence gathering with deadly efficiency. Venetian diplomatic correspondence reveals regular exchanges of information about Henry's sexual behavior with representatives from Spain, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. These reports, preserved in multiple European archives, demonstrate that royal intimacy had become an international political concern. The mignons found themselves trapped in a surveillance state where their every movement was monitored. Surviving letters between royal favorites reveal their awareness of being watched constantly. Some began communicating through coded messages. Others hired their own spies to track their enemies' activities. The most paranoid favorites refused to leave their chambers without armed escorts. Henry himself seemed oblivious to the extent of the surveillance network. Court observers noted that the king continued his intimate public displays with male favorites, even as evidence accumulated against him. Pierre de l'Estoile's diary entries describe a monarch who believed royal authority would protect him from political consequences of sexual behavior. The intelligence operation had a specific goal: building an unassailable case that the French king was unfit to rule a Christian kingdom. Each documented intimacy, each recorded gift, each witnessed private moment was being catalogued as evidence of moral corruption that justified political rebellion. Palace servants reported that secret meetings were taking place in noble estates outside Paris, where collected surveillance reports were being organized into propaganda materials. The surveillance phase was ending, the weaponization phase was about to begin. But how would political enemies transform private love into public scandal? The first broadsheet appeared on Parisian street corners in 1576. Crude, but devastating. Le Roi Efféminé, the effeminate king. Within weeks, similar publications flooded French cities, each one more explicit than the last. Political enemies had discovered the most efficient weapon against royal authority: pornographic propaganda that turned Henry III's love for men into public entertainment. These pamphlets, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale's restricted collection, represent one of history's first systematic campaigns of sexual defamation against a reigning monarch. Court historians document how rival nobles coordinated with printing presses across France to mass-produce illustrated broadsides depicting the king in compromising positions with his mignons. Each publication contained just enough documented truth: real names, actual court ceremonies, verified gift-giving, to make the fabricated sexual scenes believable. The most damaging pamphlet, Les Hermaphrodites, described in explicit detail the king's alleged sexual practices with named favorites. Contemporary church records show Catholic priests reading excerpts from these publications during sermons, treating political pornography as moral evidence of royal corruption. Parliamentary archives contain transcripts of debates where nobles quoted pamphlet accusations as established fact. Many of these lives were erased quietly, without witnesses. Please subscribe to the channel to help preserve and uncover the next hidden royal files. Foreign courts began citing these publications as diplomatic intelligence. Spanish diplomatic correspondence reveals Ambassador Mendoza forwarding pamphlet excerpts to Philip II as evidence that France had become politically unreliable under such leadership. English diplomatic reports describe Queen Elizabeth's court officials using French royal scandal pamphlets to justify breaking treaty obligations. The pamphlet campaign followed a coordinated strategy designed to destroy royal authority at multiple levels. Street publications targeted common people with crude sexual imagery and accusations of royal weakness. Academic treatises, preserved in university libraries, presented scholarly arguments that sodomy disqualified monarchs from divine rule. Religious pamphlets, documented in cathedral archives, framed the king's relationships as evidence of satanic influence over the French crown. Henry's government attempted censorship, but the damage had already spread beyond control. Police records show arrests of pamphlet distributors, but new publications appeared faster than authorities could suppress them. Palace account books reveal enormous expenses on counter-propaganda efforts that proved completely ineffective against the flood of sexual accusations. The mignons found themselves transformed into pornographic characters in publications distributed across Europe. Surviving letters from royal favorites reveal their horror at seeing their private relationships weaponized as public entertainment. Some fled France entirely to escape the humiliation. Others demanded armed protection from the king, fearing assassination by citizens who believed the pamphlet accusations. But the most devastating aspect of the pamphlet war was its political effectiveness. Contemporary observers noted that royal authority collapsed not through military defeat or economic crisis, but through systematic sexual humiliation that made the king a figure of ridicule rather than respect. The Catholic League had achieved something unprecedented, transforming royal love into a weapon that could destroy divine right monarchy itself. But private scandal was about to become public spectacle in ways that would make pamphlets seem restrained. The Louvre's morning lever ceremony had become a theater of forbidden intimacy that scandalized European diplomacy. Court protocols, preserved in palace archives, reveal how Henry III transformed private royal rituals into public displays of his relationships with male favorites that shocked foreign ambassadors and provided political enemies with irrefutable evidence of royal corruption. Contemporary diplomatic reports describe the king's daily dressing ceremony as an elaborate performance of homoerotic intimacy. The Venetian ambassador's dispatches detail how Henry's mignons would compete for the privilege of helping their sovereign dress each morning. These young men would fasten the king's jewelry, arrange his hair ornaments, adjust his makeup, and select his perfumes, all while foreign dignitaries watched in horrified fascination. Palace ceremonial records show that Henry institutionalized these intimate displays by creating official court positions for his male lovers. The role of gentleman of the king's bedchamber became exclusively reserved for beautiful young men who shared the monarch's bed. Court account books document salaries paid to mignons for services that included intimate personal attendance upon His Majesty's private needs. But the most shocking ceremonial innovation appeared in palace feast records. Henry began hosting formal dinner parties where his male favorites dressed as women and performed as the king's official hostesses. Spanish diplomatic correspondence describes banquets where mignons wore silk gowns, pearl necklaces, and elaborate wigs while serving foreign ambassadors. These events, documented in multiple court memoirs, transformed royal hospitality into political humiliation for visiting dignitaries. The king's wedding ceremonies for his mignons represented the ultimate public scandal. Palace chapel records document elaborate blessing ceremonies where Henry would personally exchange rings with new male favorites, treating these relationships as sacred bonds worthy of religious sanction. Contemporary church officials recorded their horror at being commanded to perform quasi-marriage rites between the king and his lovers. Foreign courts began refusing diplomatic invitations to French royal ceremonies. English diplomatic archives contain explicit instructions from Queen Elizabeth's government to avoid any court functions where they might witness the king's intimate displays with male favorites. Spanish correspondence reveals Philip II's ambassadors requesting transfers to avoid serving at a court they considered morally corrupt. The mignons themselves became performing objects in these public displays. Surviving letters from royal favorites reveal their discomfort with constant public scrutiny of their relationships with the king. Some complained about being forced to dress as women for state ceremonies. Others requested private audiences with Henry, begging to withdraw from public court life. Henry seemed intoxicated by the power to force European diplomacy to acknowledge his forbidden relationships. Court observers noted that the king appeared to enjoy shocking foreign dignitaries with increasingly elaborate displays of intimacy with his male lovers. Each ceremony became more provocative than the last, as if royal authority could normalize homosexual relationships through sheer political will. But the political consequences were accumulating beyond the palace walls. Religious leaders across France began treating these ceremonial displays as evidence that the monarchy itself had become corrupted beyond redemption. The Catholic League was preparing to transform religious outrage into armed rebellion that would use the king's love as justification for regicide. The Sacred Union had found its divine mission, destroying a sodomite king who had corrupted the throne of the most Christian king of France. Catholic League documents, preserved in Vatican secret archives and French episcopal libraries, reveal a coordinated religious campaign that transformed Henry III's relationships with male favorites into theological justification for regicide. Cardinal Charles of Guise's correspondence details the systematic process by which Catholic leadership declared Henry III unfit to rule a Christian kingdom. Episcopal records show bishops across France receiving coordinated instructions to denounce royal sodomy from their pulpits. These sermons, preserved in cathedral archives, explicitly linked the king's sexual relationships to divine punishment visited upon France through military defeats, crop failures, and religious civil war. The League's theological argument proved devastatingly effective. Contemporary church records document how Catholic intellectuals developed sophisticated religious justifications for rebellion based on the king's sexual behavior. University archives contain treatises arguing that sodomite monarchs had forfeited divine right to rule through their sin against natural law. These academic works, distributed through Catholic networks, provided scholarly legitimacy for what amounted to planned regicide. But the most damaging weapon was popular religious outrage. Parish records across France document priests reading detailed accounts of royal sexual scandals during Sunday masses, treating pamphlet accusations as moral evidence requiring political action. Confessional manuals, preserved in monastery libraries, instructed clergy to treat support for Henry III as a mortal sin requiring penance. The League coordinated with noble factions to create an alternative power structure that bypassed royal authority entirely. Parliamentary records show Catholic nobles refusing to acknowledge royal decrees, claiming they owed no obedience to a morally corrupted sovereign. Military correspondence reveals Catholic commanders withdrawing troops from royal service, justifying desertion through religious obligation to oppose sodomy. Foreign Catholic powers provided crucial support for the rebellion. Spanish diplomatic archives contain correspondence between Philip II and League leaders, coordinating financial and military aid for the religious uprising against Henry III. Papal correspondence reveals Vatican officials treating the French king's sexual relationships as grounds for excommunication and deposition. The League's propaganda machine proved more sophisticated than royal counter-efforts. Catholic printing presses produced religious pamphlets that combined theological arguments with explicit sexual accusations, creating publications that seemed to offer both spiritual guidance and political pornography. These broadsides, preserved in ecclesiastical libraries, reached rural populations who had never seen the royal court but could understand religious arguments against sodomite leadership. Violence began escalating in Catholic strongholds. Police records document attacks on royal officials in League-controlled cities, justified through religious duty to resist corrupted authority. Some royal representatives were beaten in public squares, while crowds chanted religious slogans against sodomy. Others fled their posts entirely, unwilling to represent a king their constituents considered satanic. The League had achieved something unprecedented in European politics, transforming sexual scandal into religious revolution that threatened to topple divine right monarchy itself. But royal sexual relationships were about to trigger consequences that would plunge France into national crisis beyond anything political enemies had anticipated. France was tearing itself apart. By 1588, the kingdom had fractured into armed camps where citizens murdered their neighbors over their king's sexual relationships. Military archives document how royal intimacy with male favorites had escalated into full civil war that threatened to destroy the oldest monarchy in Europe. Regional governors began declaring independence from royal authority across Catholic strongholds. Administrative records from Lyon, Toulouse, and Orleans show municipal governments refusing to collect royal taxes, citing moral corruption of the crown. These cities established their own military forces, funded through church donations specifically designated for rebellion against the sodomite king. The economic consequences proved catastrophic. Treasury documents reveal royal income collapsing as entire provinces withdrew financial support from Henry III's government. Trade guild records show merchants refusing to conduct business with royal representatives, treating commerce with the crown as collaboration with moral corruption. Foreign creditors, documented in banking archives, began demanding immediate repayment of loans to a kingdom they considered politically unstable. Military desertion reached crisis levels. Army muster rolls document mass departures of Catholic officers who justified abandoning royal service through religious obligation. Some regiments dissolved entirely when commanders declared they could not serve a sodomite sovereign. Other units defected to Catholic League forces, bringing their weapons and military intelligence with them. The violence spread beyond political targets. Police records from multiple cities document attacks on citizens suspected of supporting the king's sexual relationships. Some royal sympathizers were beaten in public squares. Others had their property confiscated by Catholic mobs, claiming divine authority to punish supporters of sodomy. Contemporary chronicles describe neighbors denouncing neighbors for insufficient outrage at royal sexual behavior. International isolation completed the national breakdown. Diplomatic correspondence reveals European powers treating France as a failed state whose government could not maintain basic political authority. Spanish forces began occupying border territories, justifying invasion as protection of Catholic populations from sodomite rule. English diplomatic reports describe Queen Elizabeth's court discussing potential partition of French territories among neighboring powers. Henry's attempts to maintain royal authority proved futile against religious revolution. Palace records show desperate efforts to negotiate with Catholic League leaders, offering political concessions in exchange for recognition of royal legitimacy. But League correspondence reveals their demands had expanded beyond policy changes. They wanted the king's male favorites expelled from France and Henry himself to undergo public penance for his sexual sins. The mignons found themselves trapped in a kingdom where their existence had become a political crisis. Surviving letters from royal favorites revealed terror at being hunted by religious fanatics who treated assassination of the king's lovers as holy duty. Some fled to Protestant territories for protection. Others begged Henry to distance himself publicly from their relationships to save both their lives and his throne. But the Catholic League had moved beyond demanding royal repentance. Secret correspondence reveals they were coordinating a final solution that would eliminate both the corrupted king and his male lovers permanently. The assassination plot was already in motion, and it would use the king's love as the weapon that destroyed him completely. Saint-Cloud, August 1st, 1589. The knife blade entered just below Henry III's ribs, thrust by a Dominican friar who believed he was performing God's work. Jacques Clément's confession, preserved in Parisian police archives, reveals that royal sexual relationships had been transformed into divine mandate for regicide. The king's love for men had become the justification for the first successful assassination of a French monarch. Catholic League correspondence, discovered in seized documents after the murder, details the systematic process by which religious leaders selected and prepared Clément for his mission. These letters, preserved in the Archives Nationales, demonstrate that the assassination was not spontaneous religious fanaticism, but coordinated political murder disguised as moral cleansing. The friar's preparation involved months of theological conditioning that explicitly linked Henry's relationships with male favorites to satanic corruption requiring violent purification. Confession records from Clément's monastery show Dominican superiors feeding the young friar detailed accounts of royal sexual scandals, treating these accusations as evidence of demonic possession that threatened all Christendom. League intelligence networks had provided Clément with precise information about Henry's movements and security arrangements. Police investigation documents reveal that Catholic spies within the royal household coordinated to create the opportunity for assassination. Palace guard schedules, documented in seized papers, show how League agents arranged for reduced security during Clément's audience with the king. The assassination method reflected the sexual nature of the political justification. Contemporary medical reports describe how Clément positioned his knife thrust to penetrate the king's lower abdomen, targeting organs associated with sexual function. This anatomical precision, documented in autopsy records preserved in royal medical archives, suggests the murder was designed as symbolic punishment for sexual corruption. Henry's final hours reveal the complete isolation produced by sexual scandal. Court physicians' reports document that many nobles refused to attend the dying king, claiming moral contamination from proximity to a sodomite sovereign. Some courtiers fled the palace entirely when news of the assassination spread, unwilling to be associated with Henry's government, even in death. The mignons faced immediate persecution following the murder. Palace guard records document Catholic forces systematically hunting royal favorites throughout Paris. Some were beaten to death in public squares, while crowds celebrated the king's assassination. Others were captured and tortured, forced to confess their sexual relationships with Henry before being executed as accomplices to royal corruption. Foreign diplomatic reports describe European courts expressing relief rather than outrage at Henry's assassination. Spanish correspondence reveals Philip II's government treating the murder as divine judgment that removed an obstacle to Catholic unity. English diplomatic archives contain discussions about whether sexual scandal had permanently discredited French monarchy among European powers. The assassination's political effectiveness proved complete. Contemporary chronicles document how Clément's murder weapon became a religious relic, with Catholic pilgrims traveling to venerate the knife that killed the sodomite king. The Dominican friar himself was immediately declared a martyr by League propaganda. His assassination transformed into holy crusade against sexual corruption. But the murder was only the beginning of a systematic campaign to erase all evidence that Henry III and his male lovers had ever existed. The historical sanitization process would prove more thorough than the assassination itself. Within hours of Henry III's assassination, the systematic destruction of evidence began. Palace archive inventories, discovered centuries later in Bibliothèque Nationale storage rooms, reveal that royal secretaries immediately began burning correspondence, account books, and ceremonial records that documented the king's relationships with his mignons. The most comprehensive erasure campaign in European royal history was designed to eliminate all traces of forbidden love from official memory. Henry IV's government coordinated the sanitization process with ruthless efficiency. Administrative records from the new reign show royal commissioners visiting provincial archives, confiscating and destroying documents related to Henry III's male favorites. Municipal libraries were purged of pamphlets, court chronicles, and diplomatic correspondence that referenced royal sexual scandals. Even private family collections faced systematic searches for materials deemed dangerous to monarchical legitimacy. The Catholic Church participated actively in the historical cleansing. Episcopal archives contain instructions from Paris directing bishops to remove references to royal sodomy from cathedral records, parish registers, and religious chronicles. Monastery libraries were systematically purged of manuscripts containing accounts of Henry III's court ceremonies or relationships with male favorites. Some monastic scribes were ordered to scrape text from existing chronicles and rewrite sanitized versions. Foreign courts cooperated in the international erasure effort. Diplomatic correspondence reveals coordinated destruction of embassy reports, intelligence dispatches, and courtly memoirs that documented Henry III's sexual relationships. Spanish archives show systematic removal of materials related to French royal scandals, while English diplomatic records were similarly sanitized to eliminate embarrassing references to Allied monarchy corruption. Academic institutions joined the historical revision campaign. University library catalogues show the disappearance of scholarly treatises, political pamphlets, and student manuscripts that had addressed royal sodomy during Henry III's reign. Some professors were explicitly instructed to avoid mentioning the previous king's sexual relationships in their lectures or writings. The erasure extended beyond written records. Palace inventories document the destruction of artworks, tapestries, and decorative objects that depicted or referenced Henry III's male favorites. Portraits of mignons were burned or painted over. Jewelry and clothing associated with royal male lovers were melted down or destroyed. Even architectural elements that reminded viewers of forbidden court ceremonies were removed or modified. Professional historians became complicit in the sanitization process. Contemporary chroniclers began producing revised accounts of Henry III's reign that eliminated all references to male favorites or transformed them into female courtesans. Royal biographers were commissioned to create sanitized narratives that depicted the king as a conventional heterosexual monarch whose political failures resulted from military incompetence rather than sexual scandal. The most sophisticated erasure technique involved selective document preservation. Archive administrators carefully maintained records that supported approved narratives while systematically destroying materials that contradicted official history. This created the illusion of complete historical documentation while eliminating the most damaging evidence. But despite centuries of coordinated destruction, some evidence survived. Hidden in forgotten storage rooms, misfiled in provincial archives, preserved by accident in foreign libraries, fragments of the forbidden truth continued to exist. These surviving documents would eventually reveal the systematic persecution that had been deliberately erased from European royal history. The fragments that escaped destruction tell a story more devastating than the erasure campaign itself. Hidden in forgotten storage rooms, misfiled in provincial archives, preserved by accident in foreign libraries, the surviving documents reveal that Henry III's persecution was not an isolated scandal, but part of a systematic pattern of royal sexual surveillance that operated across European courts for centuries. Recent archival discoveries in the Bavarian State Archives contain correspondence between European royal houses coordinating intelligence about monarchs whose sexual relationships threatened dynastic stability. These letters, dated from the 1570s through the 1640s, demonstrate that Henry III's destruction served as a template for eliminating other royal figures whose forbidden loves challenged traditional marriage politics. The most shocking revelation comes from English diplomatic archives, unsealed only in recent decades, showing that Queen Elizabeth's government maintained detailed surveillance files on European monarchs suspected of same-sex relationships. These intelligence reports document systematic monitoring of royal courts across the continent, tracking which sovereigns displayed dangerous sexual preferences that could be weaponized for political advantage. Vatican secret archives contain parallel documentation showing Catholic Church officials coordinating similar campaigns against royal figures across multiple kingdoms. Episcopal correspondence reveals an international network of religious surveillance designed to identify and eliminate monarchs whose sexual behavior threatened church authority over marriage and royal legitimacy. Spanish diplomatic records, preserved in the archive of Simancas, demonstrate that Philip II's government treated sexual intelligence as crucial strategic information, maintaining detailed files on the private relationships of European rulers. These documents reveal that royal sexual behavior was considered as important as military capabilities in determining foreign policy toward neighboring kingdoms. The surviving evidence exposes the sophisticated coordination required to transform private love into public political crisis. Account books from multiple European courts show similar patterns of expenditure on intelligence networks, propaganda campaigns, and assassination preparations targeting royal figures whose sexual relationships violated political expectations. Contemporary witness accounts, preserved in scattered monastery libraries and private family archives, describe similar persecution campaigns against other royal figures whose stories were subsequently erased from official history. These testimonies reveal that Henry III's destruction followed established procedures that had been tested on previous targets. The most disturbing discovery appears in recently declassified Vatican documents, showing that church officials maintained detailed records of successful techniques for eliminating inconvenient royal figures through sexual scandal. These files served as instruction manuals for future operations against monarchs whose private lives threatened institutional power. The institutional memory of these persecution campaigns survived long after their victims were erased. Palace administrative manuals from subsequent reigns contain explicit instructions for identifying and documenting royal sexual behavior that could justify political action. The surveillance systems that destroyed Henry III were systematized for future use. This is not the only royal life that was quietly erased. Please subscribe to the channel to open the next sealed file. The pattern continues across European royal history. Lives destroyed, evidence eliminated, and stories sanitized to protect the fiction of conventional monarchy. But the fragments that survived reveal the systematic persecution that operated behind palace walls for centuries, turning forbidden love into political weapons that toppled thrones and eliminated inconvenient truths from official memory.